Hey, you talk about evolution denialism. I wasn't entirely clear on what the definition of evolution was in that particular context. So are we talking about universal common ancestor, or are we talking about neo-Darwinism in terms of the mechanism of natural selection, random mutation, and other similarly undirected processes?
How exciting. I get to talk about real science for a change. The big idea of evolution is that living things shared common ancestors. We study that process, we understand that by looking at a variety of mechanisms, one of which, and probably the most important of which, is natural selection. But there's other mechanisms that bring about this descent with modification. Speciation is very important. That doesn't rely upon natural selection, and a variety of other factors. We also study the descent with modification, the common ancestry, big idea, by looking at the patterns of evolution. How has the tree of life branched through time? We do that using a very different set of observations and theory and inferences than the mechanisms. You know, it doesn't matter whether it was natural selection or something else that explains why bears and dogs had a common ancestor, but the fossil evidence, the biochemical evidence, the molecular evidence, the comparative anatomical evidence, all the evidence we have points to the inference that bears and dogs had a common ancestor, okay, regardless of what the mechanism is. So in order to understand evolution, you need to understand the big idea of common ancestry, the pattern, and the process. And those are the three components that evolutionary biologists deal with. You mentioned undirected natural processes. I don't like to use that term because to me that is a theological or philosophical term. If we look at horse evolution, say, we have right now one genus of, maybe even one species of horse, Equus, right? If we go back to the Oligocene, we got a whole bunch of horses, right? We've got grazers and browsers and three-toes and two-toes and all kinds of variation of horses back in the Oligocene, or the Miocene, this period of time 20 million years ago. If we could go back to the Miocene and we could look at all of those horses with all their variation, we wouldn't be able to say, oh, you know, 15 million years from now, we're going to have one-toed grazers. There wouldn't be anything in that variation that would allow us to make the inference that there's some sort of direction that would lead to modern-day horses. So we don't talk about the direction of evolution. Now, if you're a religious person, you might think that it was God's plan out of all the variation of horses back there in the Miocene for one-toed grazers to emerge at the end of the Pliocene. That's a religious belief. I don't have an opinion on it. So the idea of whether evolution is directed or undirected is something that's outside of what science can comment on.
Hello, can I thank you first of all for your talk. It was fascinating. I had the privilege recently of chairing the parliamentary committee in Scotland that dealt with the climate change bill, the Act as it now is, and we had an incredible degree of consensus on the fundamentals between the political parties, and it's so different from what the process is in the US and some other countries where it's really polarizing. I wanted to ask you about how these phenomena change over time, because you've talked about climate change, you've talked about evolution, you alluded as well a little bit to smoking, whether the tobacco industry was using the same kind of tactics or pioneering those tactics. How does this phenomena of new information that science comes forward with, filtering through society, how does it change over time when the evidence accumulates? Because if you think about Scotland and Europe and many parts of the US, you might think we've won the argument against the tobacco companies. I don't think we did. I think we reached an accommodation with the tobacco companies that allowed us to have smoking bans at home and let them sell cigarettes to Chinese kids to keep on making money. How does these phenomena change over time? What is the the long experience we have of debating tobacco tell us about how climate change and evolution, which obviously has a much longer history, will change as evidence continues to accumulate and become understood in society?
That has to be the most interesting question I've ever been asked. I sound like a lawyer. It depends. But it is a complicated issue. I think if you look at something like smoking, we did win the battle in one sense. Very few people think smoking is healthy for you. Okay. The science has gotten through to the public. Yeah, it's not good for you. I just came from Switzerland, and I'm probably spoiled because I live in California and hardly anybody smokes. But I was so surprised at how many Europeans are still smoking. I mean, you guys are supposed to be so far ahead of us with all that social stuff, and look what's happening. But I imagine very few of those people I saw walking down the street, including a lot of young people, unfortunately, really think smoking is healthy. The reason why people smoke is for glamour or because they've bought into various kinds of advertising that it's cool or it's rebellious or whatever. It also makes you smell bad if you smoke, so think about it that way. But very few, the science has gotten through on smoking. Nobody thinks smoking is healthful. A slide that I showed at the beginning showing the change in the attitude toward global warming, I think was to me, very disturbing because it showed a precipitous decline from approximately 2004 or 6, I think it was, to the present. Like 20 points fall in the percentage of Americans who accept that the planet is getting warmer and people have something to do with it, anthropogenic global warming. It's not just the science. The science is necessary but not sufficient. In the case of the global warming issue in the United States, you have very powerful and very wealthy interests that are arrayed against what they consider opposing forces, which they disagree with the idea of anthropogenic global warming. The science be damned, when you look at the percentage of Americans who no longer accept that global warming is taking place, something changed those opinions. The science didn't change. If anything, the science has gotten more and more solid. What has changed is a PR campaign that's been amassed against the idea of global warming. And it's been couched not in the sort of moral or religious ideological concomitants of the evolution creationism issue. It's been couched in terms of politics and in terms of social ideology, if you will. Libertarians in the United States and social conservatives tend to view the role of government as being, it should be minimized as much as possible. Government should be made to go away. I don't know what, whatever. But that's their view. They view the, what they call global warming alarmists as being quick to impose big government on the body politic, and government's going to take away our rights. Another thing that's libertarians and social conservatives are quite keen on is individual liberty. And the idea that somebody's going to say, well, we're going to tax gasoline to a level that will really encourage you to buy a smaller car, which happens here, and it's a perfectly sensible policy, of course. To many Americans, this is trampling on individual freedoms. All Americans don't agree with that point of view, obviously. When you've got a PR campaign that has the reach of the anti-global warming campaign in the United States, it is funded by wealthy individuals and by the coal and gas and oil and other extractive industries. They form nonprofit organizations through which they funnel the money. Greenwashing is the term that's often used. Perhaps you use that term here as well. Instead of being grassroots organizations, we refer to them as astroturf organizations, fake grass. But they are very powerful. Combined with Fox News and other conservative media, they have a podium that reaches huge numbers of Americans. The strategy is very good, and it goes beyond the science, which is one reason why I talked not so much about the science of global warming or the science of evolution, but I talked about the strategies of instilling doubt in people's minds. And I think in the United States, it's going to be an uphill climb. Hopefully we can get science education improved so that kids at least will get the facts before they get it wrung out of them by the media, I guess. But we have a lot of work to do. But thank you for a very interesting question.
Eugenie, my science background suggests to me that scientific propositions must be built on evidence, not on implications, not on people's background, not on what you might attribute to them, but on hard evidence. And that scientists should be prepared to debate evidence and consider evidence, whether it is sometimes uncomfortable. For that reason, I think you must stop equating intelligent design with creationism, because intelligent design is a debate about whether there is evidence of intelligent causation in the universe. The arguments based on evidence like the origin of genetic code, the origin of information, the interlocking complexity of biological systems, the fine-tuning of natural constants. Now, you may not like that argument, you may not agree with it, but it is a scientific argument, and it's not helpful to keep calling it creationism, which is a religious argument and very different. Please comment.
Thank you for your question. I refer to intelligent design creationism because the intelligent design movement, which did begin in the United States, has a history that is very closely interlocked with that of the young earth creationist and old earth creationist movements. The basic proposition in American intelligent design movement is that there are phenomena in nature, primarily biological, but also the anthropic issues in cosmology, that are either too improbable or too complicated to possibly be explained through natural causes. Therefore, intelligence must be involved. Now, the only kind of intelligence that could produce the sorts of phenomena that intelligent design people are claiming have no natural causes has to be a supernatural intelligence, which makes it a form of creationism. I'm perfectly happy. I have been in the early years of intelligent design. In fact, before intelligent design really became widely known, I was corresponding with intelligent design proponents. In the mid to late 90s, I attended intelligent design conferences, as did other scientists. The intelligent design proponents in the United States were free to make their arguments, their scientific arguments that you propose they have, to the scientific community, to the scholarly community, which would include philosophers of science as well as scientists. And after a series of conferences, some sponsored by them, some sponsored by others, they failed to do this. They have failed to convince the scientific community that they have a valid scientific view. They are welcome to keep trying, but at least in the Discovery Institute, they seem to have forgotten. They seem to not be trying. And, you know, the burden of proof is upon the intelligent design proponents to demonstrate that they can explain nature better than standard science can. Carl Sagan's famous aphorism that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. It is an extraordinary claim to say that this phenomenon or that phenomenon cannot be explained through natural causes in the light of the tremendous amount of evidence that we have had for centuries that natural causes can be found for phenomena, the natural phenomena we wish to explain. There are many very interesting theological issues involved in intelligent design. Theologians are debating them. But if your colleagues are to make a scientific argument, they need to come up with the evidence.
The whole basis of this discussion seems to be that you automatically put global warming skepticism and creationism as being on the same level. I would like to suggest that you could do it at least equally well the other way around, that it would be global warming alarmism that fits better with creationism. For example, I don't know if you know this, but Professor Ivor Glaver has just resigned from the American Physical Society, saying that he doesn't believe in the warming scare, that he believes this to be a modern religion. Now, as you will know, for a theory to be actually scientific, it has to be falsifiable by evidence. Now, what evidence have you got that, for example, when James Hansen first said in 1988 at the congressional hearings that the globe was going to warm by about 0.4 of a degree. The globe is going to warm by about 0.4 of a degree from 1979. Now, since then, it's barely warmed at all, if at all. Yet it should be, according to him, should be 1 degree warmer than it is now. It should be 1 degree warmer now than it was then, and it isn't. That should appear to falsify the theory. Now, what evidence do you have? I said, Professor Glaver, not long ago on the radio, I asked Patrick Harvey and 4 other alarmists who were on the programme if they could name a single solitary scientist who supports the catastrophic warming theory and is not paid by the state. And they couldn't. If they could name a single solitary alarmist scientist anywhere in the world who is not paid by the state and who promotes catastrophic warming. Now, they either couldn't or chose not to do so for some reason. But if you're going to claim that we have got catastrophic warming, that we have to spend many trillions of pounds on alleviation which may or may not work, you really have to provide overwhelming evidence that it is the case.
First, I made no comment on policy. I deliberately left policy out. So the notion of spending any pounds, much less hundreds of billions of pounds, is not relevant to my comment tonight. People can have a long discussion about what should be done, if anything, about global warming. Number 2, I think that the parallel is between evolution and global warming in the sense that I was talking about it, that the consensus of scientists is overwhelming that living things had common ancestors. This is really not a matter of discussion. I mean, we have scientists all over the planet who are religious and non-religious, who are employed by the state, employed in industry, who accept that living things had common ancestors. We're just not going to argue about that. The reason why the National Center for Science Education is now taking on global warming along with evolution as a topic about which we will try to assist teachers to teach is because both represent the scientific consensus. The burden of proof is on the ones who claim that the science is weak, because I forget, I think there's something like 60 international academies of sciences that have agreed that global warming is taking place and it's anthropogenic. The scientific literature surveys that have been done have shown over 95% of the articles dealing with this subject have concluded that global warming is taking place. Another point that you made was that, I have the microphone now, sir. You were able to speak. Another point that you made toward the end was, and a very good example of what I was talking about during my formal lecture, that of demonizing the opposition. Your point was that the people who are promoting global warming, who accept that it is valid science, are all somehow on the public teat, and that therefore their conclusions are to be questioned. I think that's an insult to very many hardworking scientists, and it does not become you or anyone else making that argument. We stand for the idea that the consensus scientific view should be taught in the public schools to school children. If the consensus changes on global warming, we're happy to reflect that change. For the time being, the burden of proof is on the naysayers.
Okay, yeah, you've had long enough. Thanks very much. Okay, can I ask a question? When you were talking earlier on about evolution deniers, when you were talking earlier on about evolution deniers, climate change deniers, there's obviously skepticism when we think about climate change as far as the extent to which, you know, the sun is involved and these sorts of things. The previous speaker actually made at least one decent point in that some people who are talking about climate change, admittedly a minority, but have exaggerated some of the apocalyptic scenarios, which maybe hasn't been helpful. But as you say, there's plenty of evidence for climate change, that human beings are certainly making matters worse. So I'm wondering, when you think of evolution deniers and the way how good they are at denying overwhelming evidence of Hawking conspiracy theories, of demanding caught-in-the-act evidence, all this kind of stuff, don't they actually have more in common with Holocaust deniers? And if Dr. Noble here, who is from one of your previous questioners, is from the Centre for Intelligent Design here in Glasgow, something of an embarrassment to us, I'm sorry to say. Well, no, but if he expects answers to his questions, maybe he could answer the dozen or so that he's refused to answer from Professor Braterman and myself. And if anyone would like a copy of my little tract, Creationism, Holocaust Denial, and the ID Crowd, they're very welcome to one. Maybe you can get an answer out of him where I can't. Thank you very much.
I'm not sure there actually was a question in there, but I was corrected by an individual who does not accept global warming, who was offended by the phrase global warming denialist, because the word denialist is so commonly associated with Holocaust denialism. And this person felt that this was somehow tarring him with an unfair brush. That's a mixed metaphor, sorry. But you understand what I mean. And so I use the word denial from time to time in my talk, but you notice I also used a fairly clumsy neologism of my own making, anti-global warmingist, which is crummy, but at least it doesn't offend the people whose views I'm trying to describe. My feeling is I would rather persuade somebody than win a fight. And I would not nearly be as persuasive if I start out by insulting the people whose views I'm trying to change. So I tend not to use the word denialism in a noun phrase, so to speak, in reference to somebody, although there is denial of points of views, which wouldn't necessarily attach one to something like the Holocaust. Whose law is it that the first person who brings up the Nazis loses? Okay, so don't bring up the Nazis. We can win this on the science. Winning it on the politics is a lot harder. I made the point, although I didn't, I'm still working on these ideas, so I apologize if I crammed too many ideas into one talk. I've never done that before, that's for sure, if you've watched my YouTube videos. But I probably didn't develop the idea as much as I should, and that is in that second pillar. With evolution, or the creationism mission, the second pillar is basically religious ideology stands in the way of acceptance of evolution. And ideologies are very hard to overcome. If you believe that you are going to lose very, very big if his views are right, you have very good reasons for adhering to your views. And this is basically what many conservative Christians believe about evolution. If living things descended with modification from common ancestors, to them that means that people are not specially created by God for a purpose, and so evolution is simply unacceptable. I do remind you that that's not a position that's held across the board in Christianity. There are many other interpretations of theology that accept evolution. But that being the case, ideologies make it very difficult for people to listen to evidence. We all have ideologies, okay? I'm not just saying that this is something unusual. In the case of global warming, in the United States at least, it's a very different kind of ideology. It's not so much a religious ideology. There's a tiny piece of the anti-global warming group that believes that God's providence will certainly take care of the planet for us, that this is just silly. But basically, that gets back to a politically conservative ideology that is paramount among the opposers of global warming. It's a political ideology in the US, I can't speak for Great Britain or Europe, that stresses individualism, that stresses small government, that stresses a number of features that are typical of this kind of what Naomi Oreskes calls free market fundamentalism. It's a very good phrase. It's an economic as well as a political ideology. It is frustrating to be a scientist trying to convince a creationist that evolution really happened. It must be very frustrating for climate scientists to try to convince someone who has strong ideological views opposing climate science that global warming is real. In both cases, ideology sort of sticks the fingers in the ears and makes it very difficult to evaluate empirical data. We all have ideologies. We all need to be very careful about whether we've got our own blinders on when we're looking at empirical data, because the most difficult thing there is of all is to set aside your ideologies and look dispassionately at the data. And nobody is very good at it. So maybe I just have more sympathy for my opponents.
Okay, I'll try and be quick. My question actually, and it's really eliciting a comment, very much follows on from what you've just said, I think. Professor E.O. Wilson, who you'll be well aware of, in his book The Creation, makes a very interesting sort of plea to the citizens of the United States by saying that fundamentalist Christians and himself as an evolutionary biologist may differ about the origins of the biodiversity that we see and the complexity of the planet. But what we ought to be able to agree on is that it's worth preserving and conserving into the future rather than trashing it. And that therefore Christians and scientists, if we make that dichotomy, perhaps unreasonable, should agree on trying to make sure that the planet survives into the future. Do you have any observation to make on that, in a sense, tactic as to how to bring on board everybody for looking after our environment?
First of all, I reject that there's a dichotomy between Christians and scientists. Some scientists are Christian, some scientists are not Christian, some, at any rate, you know, it's not a division into A and B. But I did mention also that there is a very strong evangelical Christian, conservative Christian theology of creation care or stewardship theology, which is precisely the kind of thing that Ed Wilson was trying to tap into. It's not a strategy, it's just, you know, you take your allies where you can get them. My interests at NCSC are fairly narrow. I want to see good science taught, and I want to see the consensus of science taught in schools. And I and my staff want to help teachers to deal with the political pressures that are being amassed against them for both evolution and for climate. Wearing my own personal Eugenie Scott hat, I am concerned about the environment. Maybe I have that ideology of environmentalism. And I would like this planet to be as lovely 20, 30, 50 years from now when I'm not here anymore as it is now. Maybe even lovelier. And I would like people to have clean air, clean water, enough food, and good medical care too, and education.